The morning mist clung to the English camp like ghostly fingers, and through it strode a king whose destiny would be written in blood and steel. King Henry V of England stood before his war-weary men, his breath visible in the October cold of 1415, knowing that beyond the fog lay 30,000 French knights eager to claim English heads. The iron banner of England, 3 golden lions on crimson, snapped in the wind above him, but it was the silence that spoke loudest. Tomorrow, legends would be born or buried forever. Sir Thomas Blackwood, a weathered knight from Yorkshire, adjusted his mud-caked armor and studied the French lines through the grey dawn. His men had marched 260 miles across hostile territory, their numbers depleted by disease and desertion. What remained was a ragged band of 6,000 souls, mostly longbowmen, whose calloused hands had drawn countless strings in practice, but never in a battle where their very kingdom hung in the balance. The French outnumbered them 5 to 1, their heavy cavalry gleaming like a metallic sea of death. "They say the French have wagered on how they'll divide us," muttered William Archer, a common soldier whose name would prove prophetic. His longbow, carved from the finest yew, had been his father's and his grandfather's before him. The weapon had seen battles in Wales and Scotland, but never had it faced such odds. Around him men whispered prayers to St. George and sharpened their daggers, knowing that if the French cavalry broke through, those blades would be their last defense. The French camp, by contrast, rang with laughter and the clink of wine cups. Marshal Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, surveyed his magnificent army with satisfaction. The flower of French nobility had assembled at counts and barons whose bloodlines stretched back to Charlemagne. Their armor was crafted by the finest smiths in Europe, their horses bred for war, their confidence absolute. They had come not merely to defeat the English but to capture their upstart king and parade him through Paris in chains. Duke Charles d'Orleans, a poet as well as a warrior, composed verses about the coming victory while his squire polished his ceremonial sword. The French nobility viewed this campaign as a grand tournament, a chance to win glory and ransoms that would fund their estates for generations. They had divided the English prisoners among themselves before the battle had even begun, arguing over who would claim the privilege of capturing the English king. The very notion that these disease-ridden invaders might prevail seemed absurd to men who had trained for war since childhood. As referenced in historical accounts from the National Archives, the English had been evading the French for days, crossing the River Somme and desperately seeking a path to the safety of Calais. King Henry's gamble had brought them to this muddy field near the village of Azin, where the narrow ground between 2 forests would compress the French advantage in numbers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the ages, where the cry of steel would determine not just the fate of armies, but the future of 2 kingdoms. The night before battle, both armies made their preparations. The English, knowing they faced almost certain death, confessed their sins to traveling priests and wrote final letters to loved ones they would never see again. The French planned their formations, confident that their heavy cavalry would crush the English rabble within the first hour of combat. Neither side could have imagined that by sunset tomorrow, the very nature of medieval warfare would be forever changed, and that the Iron Banner of England would fly over a field littered with the bodies of French nobility. The 25th of October dawned grey and merciless, with rain that had turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and despair. Sir Thomas Blackwood stood in the English front rank, his sword hand steady despite the tremor of fear that ran through the army like a plague. Around him, men who had joked and shared bread the night before now stood silent, their faces pale beneath their helms. The field stretched before them, no wider than a tournament ground, but it might as well have been the mouth of hell itself. King Henry V moved among his men like a force of nature, his voice cutting through the morning air with words that would be remembered for centuries. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," he declared. Though the exact words would be lost to history and replaced by a playwright's imagination, what remained was the essence of his message: that they stood not as subjects and sovereign, but as Englishmen united by blood and purpose. The king's presence transformed fear into fury, desperation into determination. The French army presented a sight that would have broken lesser men. 3 massive divisions of heavy cavalry, their lances bristling like a steel forest, their banners displaying the ancient arms of France's greatest houses. Duke Charles d'Orleans rode at the head of the vanguard, his golden fleur-de-lis catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Behind him came the Constable, Charles d'Albret, commanding the main battle, while the rearguard bristled with crossbowmen and men-at-arms who expected to do little more than pursue fleeing Englishmen. William Archer knocked his first arrow with hands that had steadied through sheer force of will. The longbow in his grip was more than a weapon, it was England's answer to French steel. You would that could drive a bodkin point through the finest armory at 200 paces. Along the English line, 5,000 bowmen drew their strings in unison, creating a sound like the creaking of a great ship before a storm. They had been ordered to hold until the French committed to their charge, but every man knew that once those arrows flew, there would be no retreat. The French cavalry began their advance with horns blaring and banners streaming, a sight of such terrible beauty that even their enemies paused to admire it. But the narrow field that Henry had chosen for the battle immediately began to work against them. The formations that looked so magnificent in the camp compressed into a struggling mass as knights jostled for position, their horses slipping in the mud that had been churned by thousands of hooves. What began as a controlled advance became a desperate struggle just to maintain formation. Sir Jean de Mailly, a veteran of many campaigns, felt his destrier stumble as the mud grabbed at its hooves like grasping hands. Around him, the flower of French chivalry struggled through conditions that made a mockery of their years of training. The English had chosen their ground while the field was so narrow that the French numerical advantage became a liability, with knights unable to maneuver or support each other effectively. What should have been a glorious charge became a nightmare of confusion and mounting terror. The moment of truth arrived with the whistle of thousands of arrows darkening the sky. The English longbowmen, positioned on the flanks where they could enfilade the French advance, released their first volley with mechanical precision. The bodkin points, designed to penetrate armor, found their marks with devastating effect. Horses screamed and fell, throwing their riders into the mud where they lay helpless under the weight of their own protection. The sound was like hail on a roof, but each impact meant death or maiming for the pride of France. Duke Charles d'Orléans felt his horse shudder and collapse beneath him, an arrow having found the gap in its armor. As he struggled to rise in the churning mud, weighed down by 60 pounds of steel, he realized that something had gone terribly wrong. This was not the glorious tournament charge he had envisioned, but a slaughter conducted with the cold efficiency of executioners. The English arrows fell like rain, and with each volley, the dream of an easy victory died a little more. Through the chaos, King Henry's voice could be heard shouting orders, directing his men with the calm authority of a monarch who had accepted that this day would make or break his kingdom. The French were dying by the hundreds, but they were brave men who would not easily break. The real test was yet to come, when French steel met English steel in the muddy hell that Agincourt had become. The French front line struck the English center like a thunderbolt, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. Sir Thomas Blackwood found himself face to face with a French knight, whose blue and gold surcoat was already stained with mud and blood. Their swords met with a crash that rang above the screams of dying men, and Thomas felt the shock travel up his arm like lightning. This was no longer about tactics or strategy, it was about survival, measured in heartbeats in the space between breaths. The mud had become England's greatest ally, turning the French charge into a stumbling, disorganized melee where their superior numbers meant nothing. Knights who had trained for years to fight on horseback now found themselves on foot, their heavy armor more hindrance than protection in the churning mire. Sir Jean de Mailly, struggling to his feet after his horse's death, found his visor clogged with mud and his movements reduced to clumsy, desperate swings that his English opponents easily avoided. King Henry V fought in the front rank like a common soldier, his crown replaced by a battle helm that bore the dents of French weapons. A French knight, recognizing the royal arms on his surcoat, drove forward with desperate fury, seeking the glory of killing an English king. But Henry was no ceremonial monarch. He was a warrior trained from childhood, and his sword work was as deadly as any man's on the field. The French knight fell with his skull split, joining the growing carpet of bodies that made footing treacherous for friend and foe alike. The English archers, having exhausted their arrows, threw down their bows and drew their mallets and daggers. These were not the weapons of chivalry, but the tools of butchers, designed to find the gaps in armor and finish what the longbows had begun. William Archer, his name now grimly ironic, drove his rondel dagger up through a fallen French knight's visor, ending the man's struggles with mechanical efficiency. There was no honor in this work, only the grim necessity of survival. Duke Charles d'Orléans, premier prince of France, found himself surrounded by English soldiers who cared nothing for his noble blood or the ransom he might bring. His gilded armor, crafted by the finest smiths in Paris, was caked with mud and dented by common hammers. As he fell to his knees, overwhelmed by numbers and exhaustion, he realized that this battle was destroying not just an army but an entire way of life. The age of chivalry was drowning in English mud. The French rearguard, seeing the disaster unfolding before them, began to waver. These were men who had expected to pursue fleeing English soldiers, not to charge into a killing field where their own nobility was being systematically slaughtered. Marshal Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, fell with an English arrow through his throat, and with his death, the last hope of French coordination died as well. The battle was becoming a rout, but it was a rout that would cost both sides dearly. As chronicled in military histories, the battle's turning point came when the French began to surrender in such numbers that King Henry faced a terrible choice. His army was exhausted, his supplies limited, and he could not guard thousands of prisoners while maintaining his defensive position. The order that followed would stain his reputation forever, but it would also ensure his victory. The prisoners, except for the highest nobility, were put to the sword, a decision that shocked even the hardened soldiers who carried it out. Sir Thomas Blackwood, standing over the body of his French opponent, felt no triumph in the victory. Around him lay the flower of French chivalry, their bright banners trampled in the mud, their songs of glory silenced forever. The English had won the day, but at a cost that would echo through the generations. The age of the mounted knight was ending, killed by a common bowman whose name's history would never remember. The field of Agincourt had become a charnel house, where the dreams of two kingdoms lay shattered among the dead. The Iron Banner of England still flew, but it flew over a world that had changed forever. In the distance, the survivors of the French army fled toward the horizon, carrying with them the news that would reshape the balance of power in Europe. The legend of Agincourt was born, but it was a legend written in blood and sealed with the cries of dying men. The silence that followed the battle was more terrible than the clash of arms had been. Sir Thomas Blackwood stood among the dead and dying, his sword still in his hand, unable to comprehend that he had lived through the slaughter. Around him, the field of Agincourt resembled nothing so much as a butcher's yard, with the bodies of French nobility piled like cordwood in the mud. The rain had washed the blood into pink streams that snaked between the corpses, and the air was thick with the groans of wounded men calling for their mothers in French and English alike. King Henry V walked among his men, his royal presence somehow diminished by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. The victory was absolute, almost 6,000 French dead against barely 400 English were losses, but the king's face showed no joy, only the grim satisfaction of a man who had gambled everything and won. He paused before each group of survivors, speaking quietly to men who had seen too much death to celebrate, knowing that this day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. William Archer, no longer an archer but a killer of men, sat beside his discarded longbow and stared at his hands. They were stained with blood that no amount of washing would ever completely remove, and he knew that he would see the faces of the men he had slain in every dream for years to come. The common soldiers understood what the nobles would never admit, that they had not won through superior courage or divine favor, but through superior killing, and that knowledge was a burden heavier than any armor. The French prisoners who had been spared watched their captors with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Duke Charles d'Orleans, his golden armor now dented and filthy, found himself guarded by men who would have been beneath his notice in peace. The social order that had governed Europe for centuries had been overturned in a single afternoon, and the implications were staggering. Common bowmen had brought down the greatest knights of France, and the world would never be the same. The aftermath of battle revealed the true cost of medieval warfare. The English surgeons, such as they were, moved among the wounded with saws and cauterizing irons, their methods as brutal as the weapons that had created the injuries. Men who had survived the fighting now faced the greater challenge of surviving their wounds, and many who had cheered the victory would not live to see another dawn. The ravens and crows that gathered at the field's edge waited with inhuman patience for their feast to begin. Sir Jean de Marly, wounded but alive, was carried from the field by English soldiers who showed him more mercy than he had expected. His leg was shattered, his sword arm useless, but he had survived where greater men had perished. As he was loaded onto a cart with other wounded prisoners, he reflected on the irony that his life had been saved by the very men he had tried to kill. The rules of war were changing, and honor was becoming a luxury that few could afford. The English began the grim task of stripping the dead, a necessity that transformed heroes into scavengers. The French dead wore fortunes in armor and jewelry, and the common soldiers claimed what they could before the nobles could establish their rights to the spoils. It was ugly work, but it was the only payment these men would receive for their service, and they approached it with the same methodical efficiency they had shown in battle. King Henry ordered the French dead to be counted and recorded, a task that revealed the true magnitude of the slaughter. Among the fallen were 3 dukes, 5 counts, 90 barons, and over 1,500 knights, the cream of French nobility, wiped out in a single afternoon. The political implications were staggering, as whole family lines had been extinguished and vast estates left without heirs. France would take generations to recover from this single day's losses. As night fell over the battlefield, the English made their preparations to continue the march to Calais. They had won the battle, but they were still deep in enemy territory with wounded men and valuable prisoners to guard. The victory at Agincourt had changed everything, and nothing there was still outnumbered, still far from home, still vulnerable to the revenge that France would surely seek. The Iron Banner of England flew over a field of victory, but it was a victory that raised as many questions as it answered. The legend of Agincourt was already being born in the songs of minstrels and the tales of survivors, but those who had lived through the battle knew that legends were poor comfort for the reality of war. They had written their names in history with blood and steel, but the price of immortality was higher than any of them had imagined. The cry of steel had been answered, but its echo would haunt them forever. 3 days after the battle, the English army limped toward Calais like wounded wolves, their victory a burden as heavy as their spoils. Sir Thomas Blackwood rode at the head of his diminished company, his surcoat bearing new tears that no amount of mending could make whole. Behind him, carts groaned under the weight of wounded men and French prisoners, while the survivors walked in silence, their eyes holding memories too terrible for words. The Iron Banner of England still flew, but it flew over an army that had been forever changed by what they had witnessed and done. The French prisoners, particularly the high nobility, presented a problem that King Henry had not fully anticipated. Duke Charles d'Orleans, worth a king's ransom, required a guard detail that could ill be spared, while lesser nobles demanded treatment befitting their station. The English, exhausted and suspicious, granted what courtesy they could while remaining alert for treachery. The bonds between captor and captive were complex, forged in the crucible of shared survival and mutual respect earned through combat. News of the disaster at Agincourt spread through France like wildfire, carried by survivors who had fled the field and by English heralds who proclaimed King Henry's victory at every crossroads. The French court, already weakened by the madness of King Charles VI, reeled under the impact of losing so many of its greatest nobles in a single day. Entire regions found themselves without leadership, their lords dead on a muddy field in northern France, their castles and estates suddenly vulnerable to English ambition. William Archer, walking beside his recovered longbow, carried with him more than just his weapon. He bore the knowledge that common men could topple the greatest nobility if they had the will and the means. The implications were revolutionary, though he lacked the education to fully understand them. In village halls and taverns across England, men like him would tell their stories, and those stories would plant seeds of change that would grow for generations to come. The social order itself had been wounded at Agincourt, perhaps mortally. The march to Calais became a race against time and French vengeance. Scouts reported that new French forces were gathering, led by nobles who had not been present at the battle and who burned with the need to avenge their fallen comrades. King Henry drove his men hard, knowing that another battle in their weakened state could undo everything they had achieved. The victory at Agincourt had been complete, but it would mean nothing if the army could not reach the safety of the English-held port. The wounded presented the greatest challenge. Men whose injuries made them a burden the army could ill afford, but whose sacrifice demanded that they not be abandoned. Surgeons worked by torchlight, their crude tools and methods claiming almost as many lives as they saved. Sir Jean de Mailly, delirious with fever from his infected wounds, spoke in dreams of the charges he would never make again, his voice adding to the chorus of suffering that rose from the medical cots like incense to a god of war. As referenced in historical records from the British archives, the aftermath of Agincourt revealed the changing nature of medieval warfare and its political implications. The English victory had been achieved not through superior nobility or divine favor, but through superior tactics, technology, and the ruthless efficiency of common soldiers. The longbow had proven itself the great equalizer, capable of bringing down the mightiest knight, and its impact on European military thinking would be profound and lasting. The French response to the disaster was swift and desperate. New armies were raised, led by nobles who had learned hard lessons from the fate of their predecessors. The English victory at Agincourt had won them a battle, but it had also awakened a sleeping giant that would not easily be subdued. The war would continue, perhaps for generations, and each engagement would be fought with the shadow of Agincourt hanging over it like a curse. King Henry's march to Calais became a testament to the discipline and endurance of his men, but it also revealed the limits of medieval logistics and the precarious nature of military campaigns. The army that had won such a magnificent victory was still vulnerable to disease, exhaustion, and the simple challenge of moving hundreds of wounded men across hostile territory. Victory in battle was only the beginning of the larger struggle for strategic success. The Iron Banner of England flew over a column of survivors who had achieved the impossible, but their achievement came with a price that would echo through the ages. They had broken the power of French chivalry, but they had also unleashed forces that would reshape the nature of war itself. The cry of steel had been answered at Agincourt, but its echoes would resonate through the centuries, changing not just the fate of kingdoms but the very nature of power itself. The gates of Calais opened to receive an army that had achieved the impossible, but King Henry V entered the English-held port with the bearing of a man who understood that his greatest victory might also be his greatest burden. The Iron Banner of England was raised above the walls, its 3 lions now witnesses to deeds that would echo through the ages, but those who had lived through Agincourt knew that legends were built on foundations of blood and bone. The survivors who walked through those gates were no longer the same men who had left them weeks before. Sir Thomas Blackwood, his armor bearing the scars of French steel, stood watch over the French prisoners as they were secured in the castle's dungeons. Duke Charles d'Orleans, his golden spurs now tarnished with mud and defeat, looked upon his captors with eyes that held a new understanding of war's true nature. The age of chivalric romance was ending, killed by English arrows and common men's mallets, and even the highest nobility could no longer pretend that birth and breeding were proof against steel and determination. The reckoning of Agincourt extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of battle. In England, the news of victory sparked celebrations that would last for months, but those who had fought knew that the real work was only beginning. The French would not accept defeat so easily, and the English would need to hold what they had won. The victory had made Henry a hero, but it had also made him a target for every ambitious French noble who sought to restore his country's honor. William Archer, his longbow finally laid aside, found himself elevated beyond his birth by the simple fact of survival. The common soldiers who had stood firm at Agincourt became the heroes of countless ballads, their names or the names given to them by storytellers woven into the fabric of English legend. But fame was a cold comfort for men who had seen too much death, and many would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they had done in the name of king and country. the political implications of Agincourt rippled across Europe like stones thrown into still water. The French court, already weakened by royal madness and noble rivalries, found itself facing a crisis of leadership that would take years to resolve. England, conversely, found itself in a position of strength it had not enjoyed since the days of Edward III. The balance of power had shifted, and with it, the entire strategic landscape of the 100 Years' War. The French dead at Agincourt were mourned in countless castles and manor houses across France, their deaths creating a hunger for vengeance that would drive French policy for generations. The flower of French nobility had been cut down in a single afternoon, but France was a resilient nation with deep reserves of strength. The English victory had been magnificent, but it had also awakened a determination that would prove costly in the years to come. The prisoners taken at Agincourt became pawns in a larger game of diplomacy and war, their ransoms funding English military operations, while their presence in English castles served as constant reminders of French defeat. Duke Charles d'Orléans would remain in English captivity for 25 years, his poetry reflecting the melancholy of a man who had seen his world destroyed in a single day. His words would outlive the battle itself, testament to the human cost of political ambition. The technological implications of Agincourt were perhaps the most profound of all. The longbow had proven itself superior to heavy cavalry, but it had also demonstrated the importance of combined arms tactics and the value of choosing favorable ground. Military theorists would study the battle for centuries, learning lessons that would influence the development of firearms and the eventual obsolescence of medieval warfare itself. As the English army recovered in Calais, preparing for the long journey home, the survivors of Agincourt began to understand that they had participated in something far greater than a mere battle. They had witnessed the end of one age and the beginning of another, where common men could bring down princes, and where technology mattered more than tradition. The cry of steel had been answered, but it had awakened echoes that would resonate through the centuries. The Iron Banner of England flew over Calais, but it flew over a world that had been forever changed by the events of October 25, 1415. The legends forged in the fires of war would inspire generations of Englishmen, but they would also haunt the dreams of those who had lived through the reality. Agincourt had made heroes of common soldiers and beggars of proud nobles, proving that beneath the Iron Banner of war, all men were equal in the face of death. The battle was over, but its legacy would endure as long as men remembered the day when English arrows darkened the sky and French chivalry died in the mud of a forgotten field.